Gamze.
Okay.
Gamze.
Yep, Gamze the Taiva. Okay, the Eibishter's health. We're going to start Masechta Gittin Daf Chof Aleph, and we are holding Daf Chof Amid Beis about like 6 lines from the bottom. Boy Rami Bachama. Okay, very simple. We learned before. Rami Bachama asked the question. Inshallah, we learned before that. I mean, this is a halacha that the Torah says the kosav, that the husband is supposed to write the get. Correct? The kosav. He's supposed to own the paper and write the get. So now the question is like this: the piece of paper, let's call it the tablet, was definitely hers. Everybody knows it's hers. But the get kosav aleha. But there's a get written on it. So v'harei hi yoitza b'tachas yodei. She got it from him. In other words, we know that he gave a get to her by writing the get on her piece of paper. So now the question, hi Lewis, we just began. So we just began Chaf Amid Beis, 6 lines from the bottom. So the question is, this piece of paper, a woman who owns something, can she really give it over to her husband that really wants to divorce her and have full mind that it should belong to him? You know, in order for it to work, she has to really give him the piece of paper that it should really be his piece of paper. So the question of the Gemara is very simple. The question is, she owns a piece of paper, and she is required to give it over to him. So now he owns the paper, so he can write the get. Now we see he wrote a get on it and gave it back to her. So the question was, when she gave him the piece of paper, did she really have a complete 100% in mind that the husband should keep this piece of paper? It should be like his. Maybe a woman can't be makna something like this. That's the Gemara's question.
Yes, fast the divorce. Was she giving a paper and we make it fast?
I know, but is she really mean it? Does she? Mao, that's the question. Me, I'm reading a woman. Me, I'm reading. Do we say aknuya aknele? She gave him the piece of paper. She was makne him the piece of paper. She sold him the piece of paper or gave it to him. Dilma, maybe Isha, or we don't know. A woman, lo yada laknuya. She doesn't know how to 100% give something over in her mind to somebody else. Amar Abai says, Toshma, come in here. There's a brisa that said, Avhu heyed al kfar koton shahoy b'tzad Yerushalayim. There was a testimony on this small little village that was next to Jerusalem. There was this old man. He was the rich guy that was lending money left and right to anybody in the free loans. Plus, and you have to speak this out, people would sell him property. But they would write the koise b'ksav yodai. They would write it in his handwriting. In other words, he owned the piece of paper. And other people would sign the piece of paper. So let's say he wanted to buy a property. So he pulls out the piece of paper and he would write up the document that you're selling me this piece of paper, this property, and the seller would sign on the piece of paper. The problem with that is that the piece of paper has to belong to the seller. So how is it that if it's his piece of paper, how is he giving it over to the seller? The Chachamim, this story came to the Chachamim. They sanctioned, they okayed every transaction he made. So the Gemara says, "Va'amai." But why did they approve every transaction that he made? The real person that's supposed to own the piece of paper is the seller of the property. Habeinam sefer mikna. The sefer, the document, has to belong to the seller. Veleka, in this case, it doesn't belong to the seller. It belonged to this rich guy who's buying it, and he also had a bunch of pieces of paper. The elamai, elalav, it must be, because you do say mishum damrinin aknuya magnale, that a person has the ability to transfer ownership of a piece of paper to the seller, and therefore that makes the sale valid. So why don't we say the same thing about the woman? She owns the piece of paper, and she transfers and basically sells the piece of paper or gives it in her mind to her husband so that he can write a get. Why don't we say the same thing? Rava says there's a big difference. My kushya, what is your difficulty with this brisa and my question of Rami Bachama? Dilma, this brisa is different. We go to Chaf Aleph Amud Aleph. Zakein Shani, an old person, and that's the story of this guy, rich guy, who was an educated person. He was a chacham, okay? And obviously, he had some money, so he might be a chacham too. And he knows a star wouldn't work unless it belongs to the seller. And therefore, he had Gemiras Das. He had 100% in mind to give the paper over to the seller. But a woman doesn't know so much. And therefore, maybe she's not completely giving it over to the husband. She's just lending him the piece of paper. And if she's just lending him the piece of paper, it's not a valid get. The Rava said, Elo Marava. So Rava says, Mahacha, we learn it from over here. Orev hayotzid la'achachita shtoras. You have a cosigner, right? A guarantor, we'll call him. A guarantor that comes after the get was signed, after the document was signed, a loan document, and then a guarantor under the Eidim says, I guarantee that this borrower will pay the loan. Then he collects from the guy, even though the guarantor, you could collect from the guarantor, you could go after the guarantor only from movable objects, but you can't, and objects that he owns, not land that he sold in the interim. But the point is that a person could be called a guarantor, even though after the signatures and the shtar is in the hands of the malva, of the lender. And in order for a person to be called a guarantor, the paper has to belong to the guarantor. And you see, nevertheless, that any person who is a lender, not just a zakein, but any person who lends money to somebody, even now that he owns the IOU, it's in his hand, he can ask a guarantor to guarantee this loan. And the guarantor can do that by signing his name at the end of the document, saying that he guarantees. Yeah, but how does that work if the guarantor does not own the piece of paper that the IOU is written on? You see, normally when I borrow money, I own the piece of paper and I write, I owe so-and-so money, and then I give the lender the piece of paper. So by giving the ownership of that piece of paper to him, that makes the loan effective. But here, how did the Orev guarantee the paper? If the paper belonged to the IOU, was already in the hands of the lender. It must be that the lender gave it over to the guarantor for just that brief moment. So he totally, in his mind, gave it over to the guarantor. So that should be a good proof that the woman, even though she owns the piece of paper, for that moment, she 100% gives it over to her husband. She doesn't loan the piece of paper to her husband. She gives it over to her husband so that he can write a get. So that's a good answer to that question. Amar Ravashi my kushya. Then this is where it ends. Dilma ga'avra shana. A man who went to yeshiva knows the halacha. Biyade laknuye. He knows how to sell something. He knows that 100% you have to give it over to somebody else. And in this case, the lender has to totally give over the piece of paper to the guarantor. But maybe a woman is not 100%. Maybe in her mind, she's just lending the piece of paper to her husband, but she doesn't 100% give it over to the husband as if he has ownership. Elo Ravashi, and here Ravashi says it's obvious that she can do it because the Mishnah says that. And this is what makes this whole question strange, because it's an open Mishnah. The Mishnah said, Isha, a woman, she could take her own piece of paper, Kosebes as Gita, she writes the get. Let's say she's a good scribe, so she writes the get. And this husband takes it and signs on it, that he agrees with it, or gets Adam to sign in it. And it's good. V'ish Kosebes Schreibreit. And not only that, a man could write his receipt that the woman and then give it to the woman. In other words, that if for him to have paid the ksuba, she has to write him a receipt that she received the ksuba money. So he writes up the receipt, gives it to her momentarily, and then she signs on it that she agrees, and he gives it back, and she gives it back to him. Get because what makes a valid get is only its signature. So the point is that we see that she can own the piece of paper, even write the get, and for that moment she transfers total ownership of that piece of paper to her husband. And once the husband owns it, he could get sign on it and get Adam to sign on it. And that's it. We accomplish with that he owns the piece of paper. And that's the way we follow through what the Torah says, that he has to own the piece of paper and give it over to his wife. And that's why it's an effective get. Nu Gemara. Amar Rava said. Now, in the Mishnah, we learned that one can give the get over to write the star, the get, on the hand of an eved. And then you have to give her the slave over to the woman, the total slave over to the woman. And then you could put the slave in her property, and therefore the get and the eved is one the same. The slave is the get. But here Rava says a different case. She doesn't own anything, but kasav la get unasana b'yadam. He wrote a get and put it on the hand of a slave. That's what the husband did. Kasav la shtar matana olav, and he wrote that the ownership of this slave belongs to her. So now the get is now in her property. What's her property? The slave. Where's the get? On the slave's hand. So therefore, it works. She bought the slave, and she gets divorced with that. Because we say the ownership of the slave as acting as her courtyard, her chotzer, her property, happens at the same time, maybe even prior, and before the get, and therefore the get is an effective get. So it's almost like the get went into her property at the same time. So the Gemara says, "Va'amai." The question is, how can a slave be called a chotzer? A chotzer means, let's say a woman owns a property, so it's her backyard. She owns a private property, so if you throw the get into her backyard, that works. The Torah says, "V'nosam b'yada," you have to give the get into her hand. The Torah doesn't mean you have to give it exactly into her hand. You could actually give the get into her property. So why is it, the question is, that if you put a get into the hand of the eved, so let's say you even didn't write it on the hand of the eved, you gave the get into the hand of the eved, does it work? Why is an eved called a good chotzer? Chotzer mahalechasi. The chotzer mahaleches loikona. A chotzer that can move by itself should not be effectuate a kinyan, because it walks. If you can't throw, if she owns a wagon or something that's moving, throwing a get into that wagon is not good get, because that's a chotzer mahaleches, the chotzer that moves around. So why is an eved holding on to a get, and she owns the eved, considered to be a good chotzer? The chitem, but are you going to say ba'oimid that Rava was talking about when the get stood in one place? And therefore, by staying in one place, that makes him, he's not moving at that time, so he becomes a good chotzer. Rava said, not true. Kol she'ilu mahalech loikona. If it would move, it would not work. Even if it stood and sat in one place, it would not be kaina. So therefore, it wouldn't work, because potentially the eved can work. So why could an eved? The question is, why can a human be considered to be a chotzer, like a backyard of the woman? It's a chotzer mahaleches. It's a type of courtyard that can move around. The type of courtyard that moves around, that's mobile, is not considered to be a good courtyard. And says the Gemara v'hilchas b'kafos, we're talking about that the eved was tied up, and therefore he's immobile and in handcuffs, and therefore simply that's why the get is working when it's in the hands of the get in the eved. Rava said, "Kasav lo get unusana b'chatzeirai, v'kasav lo shtar matana olav kinasanu umisgreshes boy." Here, the husband wrote a get and put it into his own backyard. But at the same time, he wrote her a deed of the gift that she owns the chotzer. She owns this backyard. So kanasuhu, she acquires the backyard, umiskereshes boy, and she gets divorced with it. Same idea, just the same thing. what Rava said before, that if he gives her the eved, the tied up eved, and the get in the eved's hand, she acquires the eved and she gets divorced with it. So the Gemara says, Utsricha, why do Rava have to teach you this halacha twice? That you can actually effectuate a get by writing the get and letting her acquire the chatzir at the same time. So the ashvi'inam, if it would just say eved, that the slave case, when he's giving her the slave to act as the chatzir, havamina dafka eved, I would think only if a slave is holding on to the get and you're letting her acquire the slave, that's when it's a good chatzir. Because that makes it good, because you could acquire the slave and the get at the same time. But if he did that with a regular backyard, where he wrote the get and put it into his own backyard, and it was makna her the chatzir at the same time, I would think the chachamim would make that it should not work, because ligzer mishim chatzera habal la'achar makan, that I should be geyser that maybe if you allow that to happen, sometimes a husband will throw the get into somebody else's courtyard, not his own, but somebody else's courtyard, and that person will gift that courtyard to her. And in that case, it doesn't work, because there was a step in between him giving the get and her acquiring the get. The Torah says when he writes the get and gives her the get, it has to happen with no interruption. And here, the interruption is that he wrote the get and put it into somebody else's courtyard, and somebody else's courtyard had to gift that courtyard to her. So that wouldn't work. So I would think that even if he put it into his own courtyard and wrote that she should acquire his own courtyard, it should also not work. So we kamash malan that we're not goyzer that way. That's why you had to teach us the case by chotzer. If Rava would have only taught about the case of chotzer, havamina, I would think dafka chotzer. Chotzer would work if you give it to her at the same time as the get. But aval eved, but the slave, when he writes the get, puts it in the hands of the eved and lets her acquire the slave at the same moment, ligzar kafas atu she'ena kafas. I should make a gzera that you should not be able to acquire it, because the only way this works is if the eved is tied up. So maybe if you allow him to do that, maybe he will do this in a case where the eved is not tied up. Kamash B'lam, that it works both by the eved and both by the chatzir. So the Gemara asks a question. Amar Abaya asks, Michte, let us see. Chatzir meheches rabbe. Where do you know that a chatzir works at all? Because the Torah says miyada, from her hand, right? You put it in her hand, so we say it doesn't mean her hand. You could put it into her property. But ma yada the isa bein medata bein balkarcha, her hand, when the husband puts the get into her hand, she could willingly take it, or he could stuff it into her hand, even if it's against her will. Av chetzera, when you're putting into her courtyard, the isa, it has to be in a situation bein medata bein balkarcha, whether if she wants it or if it's against her will. But in order for this type of case to work, she has to participate in acquiring the chatzir. Bahabatana, because of this gift, Bitate Isa, this chatzir only works if she willingly wants to acquire the chatzir. Bal Kochalech said it can't work against her will. In other words, the whole concept of get is that the husband can divorce her against her will. But in this case, where he's telling her, here's the get, and I put it into my chatzir, but you have to acquire the chatzir in order for you to get the get. So, but she has to participate and willingly acquire the chatzir. So, but that doesn't fit into the function of get, which tells us that it has to be always done against her will. So that's why Abaya doesn't like that Rava's case. So Maskiv Rav Shimi bar Ashish, Rav Shimi asked against Abaya, "V'shlichus lakabala dimidaiti isa bal korchalesa v'kahav shliach lakabala." We find that if she put up a shliach to accept the get, she has to want that this person to be her shliach. Against her will, that person can't be her shliach. And we see that she participates in wanting something in order to make the get happen. So why can't we say that she participates in wanting something of a gift, of the gift of the chatzir to make the get happen? What's your problem, Abaya? Abaya says shlichus is different. Ata shlichus miyadis, Rabbi. The Torah says put it into her hand against her will. But the fact of shlichus, that she could send somebody to accept the get, that's not from the word yada, V'shiach v'shlicha isravi. That is coming from the word shilach v'shilcha, which is a double language. So there, the Torah gives you the leniency that she is allowed on her own volition decide somebody to accept the get on her behalf. The by saying, if you want, I can tell you, shlichus l'kabol nami ashkecham bal korcha, that there's a possibility of a woman accepting a get against her will, even with a shliach that she never even sent. How's that possible? If she didn't make the shliach, a woman who's married, who's like on the bas mitzvah, and her father married her off, and the father could be the shliach of makabel git levite bal korcha. A father could accept the get on behalf of his young daughter, even against her will. So we see there's a concept of shlichus even against her will. That's how the concept of shlichus works. But Abaye still remains with his question on Rava, since this chotzer requires her to want to acquire the chotzer, it would not work because the whole concept of get has to be able to be done against her will. Next, Mishnah says, ala olish azayis. And if you write a get on the leaf of the zayas tree, if it's not connected to the ground, or you could write it on the slave of the eved, you have to give the eved over to the isha, and also you have to if you wrote it on the horn of a cow, you give the cow over to the isha. So the Gemara says like this: Bishlam yad the eved. The reason why, if the slave's hand is written the get on the slave's hand, you can't chop. We go to Amud Beis. You can't chop the hand off the eved. You're not allowed to do koivel. You're not allowed to You're not allowed to injure an eved. So therefore, that's why the Mishnah said, give her the eved, because you can't separate the get from the eved. So you give her the eved. Ela karen shel para. If you wrote the get on the cow's horn, why can't we, after writing the get, lick to say v'leis v'la, cut off the horn and give it to her? What's the problem? Why do you have to give her the entire cow? Makra, and says the Gemara, because Parsa says v'kasa v'nasalah. Right after it says you write the get, you give it to her. So there has to be one step, nothing in between. You have to write it and then right away give it to her. The only way it works, if the only thing missing is writing the get and giving the get. But when you write it on the horn of a cow, there's another step. It's you have to write it, tzitza, then cut off the horn of the cow, unsina, and giving it. So there, the Torah says it's possible. The only way it works is only if it goes 1-2. You write the get and give it to her. But if there's another step in between, it's not a kosher get. Rabbi Yossi Aglili said in the Mishnah that you can't write a get on a leaf of an olive tree, or because it's a food item, albeit for animals, and also you can't write it on an animal. You can't write the get on an animal. So the Gemara asks, my time with Rabbi Yossi Aglili. Why does Rabbi Yossi Aglili hold his opinion? The Tanya, we learned to the Brisa, the Torah says you write a get sefer in a parchment. Eila sefer. The Torah says you write a get in a parchment. Minayin l'rabis kol davar. How do I know to include anything? You could write a get on any piece of writing material. Amad loyim of a cost of law. You write it, and therefore mikol mokan. That implies you could write it on anything. So in Kema Talmud Bavli Sefer, then why did the Torah write it on a parchment if the Torah does not mean you dafka have to write it on a parchment? So the answer is because it has to be similar to a parchment. Ma Sefer, just like a parchment, it's not an animal and it's not a food. Anything that's not an animal and not a food that you could write on. So you could basically write on a piece of wood or on anything. But as long as it's not an animal or a food, in that way we compare it to a parchment. Rabbanan. So the question is, what do Rabbanan do? How come Rabbanan say you could write it on an animal? So the Rabbanan will say, if we would say write it in a parchment, I would say. But the word b'sefer, according to the Chaman, doesn't mean write it b'sefer in a parchment document. Hashlik siv sefer, the Torah wrote sefer, because of lo sefer krisis means l'sfiras devarim hu asa. Have a document that tells the story of what's happening here, that she's no longer married. Not that the word sefer means a parchment. Sefer could mean a parchment, but that's only if it says bis sefer in a parchment. But now that the Torah wrote sefer without the base, it means write it that it tells a sipur, like Sipur Yitzias Mitzrayim. It tells the story of separation. So therefore, there is no limitation in the pasuk of where you could write it on. The Torah is just all inclusive. Anything is kosher to write a get on, even an animal and food. So now the Gemara asks, then what did they do with the v'kosav, where the Torah says that you have to write the get, and the Torah says an extra addition that you could write it on anything. Of course you could write it on anything, because the Torah doesn't say you should write it on something, so of course you could write it on anything. So what do they do with the word v'kosav, which is an extra pasuk that tells you should write it on anything? What did Rabbanan need that for? So the Gemara says, they have to teach you this new idea. That I would think that only with a document she could become divorced, not that he or she gives him that he gives her money and says, now you're divorced. Because I would have thought I would think the get should be like the kedushin. Ma havaya bekasa. Just like when you marry a woman, you give her money to get married. Afitzia nami bekasa. So also when you're getting divorced, just give her money and you're divorced. Kamash malam. That's what the Torah says. It's only because you're writing something down, and that's the only way to get divorced. No other way. So we don't juxtapose in that sense. We don't juxtapose get to kedushin. What does Rabbi Yosef Glili do with that? How does he know that idea? Nafkele misefa creases. The Torah says cut it off. So another pasuk that says sefer creases, sefer karsa, veindava acha karsa. Only a document can separate man and wife, and nothing else. So that's how he knows that concept. The Rabbanan, what do they do with sefer creases? They know that only a document because from the kosav. So what did they do with sefer creases? The Torah is telling you that the separation between man and wife has to be total. In other words, there's no strings attached. In the tiny we learned to the brisa. If a man says, "Here's your get," you never are not allowed to drink wine, or you're never allowed to go to your family to visit your family. That's the condition of the get. So since there's a condition that lasts forever, ain't that creases? That's not a creases. That's not called a separation, because she can never get rid of that condition. So therefore, that's how Rabbanan used the pasuk of sefer creases, that it has to be if you're putting a condition, it has to be a condition that she can, with time, undo that, but not a total forever condition. So if the limitation, hareze creases, that's called a separation. The edach, and now where does Rabbi Yosef Glili know that concept? Mikares creases. The Torah says sefer kares, and the Torah could have said sefer kares and wrote creases, extra words. Therefore, he knows both concepts. He knows this concept of it has to be a total separation, and also from the creases you learn that only a document divides, can be used as a get. The idach rabbanan. What do they do with creases kares? It seems to be an extra longer word. Creases kares like darshan. They don't darshan the extra longer word. Kares creases is one word, and therefore you don't have nothing extra in that word to darshan another teaching. We'll do the Mishnah very quickly, and then we'll stop. The Mishnah says you cannot write a get, obviously, on a leaf, let's say, that's connected to the ground, or a tree stump. Let's say you wrote the get while it was connected, but then tloshay, you uprooted it or chopped it down. And then you had Adim sign it, and you gave it to her, kosher, then it's kosher. Rabbi Yehuda Paisel, Rabbi Yehuda says, no, even though we would think that the chesima should be enough, he said, no, we need both. I should take sivasoi, the chesimasoi betolish. The writing and the signing of the get has to be when it's disconnected and from the ground. Rabbi Yehuda ben Meseir Ayma. Rabbi Yehuda says a new idea. Ein koisvin, you're not allowed to write a get, loy al hanayor hamochuk, and a piece of paper that was erased already. So therefore, because this piece of paper was erased already, if you're going to write a get on it, a person could re-erase it and you won't know it was erased for the first time, because this paper had something written on it. It was erased. Now you're going to write a get. If there was a condition on the get, she could easily erase that. And you won't know that she erased it because this was an erasable, it was erased once before. V'loy al diftera. And al diftera is a type of also a document where when you erase on this type of document, you can't notice that something was erased. So you can't write a get on these two items. Because that document is something that can be forged. She can just erase an important condition of the get, and we will never know that this condition was not met. That's what the Rabbi Yehuda ben Meseir says. Someone says no, it's kosher, and the Gemara is going to explain what the reason is, that even if you write a get on an erasable, forgeable type of piece of paper, it's still going to be a kosher get. Okay, so ends Daf Off.